Intellectual honesty is a crime in any totalitarian country, but even in England, it is not exactly profitable to speak and write the truth.
The Interplanetary Podcast. The exploration of space. For the benefit of all humankind. Your host, in Guildford, England, Matthew Russell.
Oh yeah, baby, George Orwell. It's been a long week. I'm trying to make these episodes a little bit more evergreen, I guess, and not do too much space news. But of course, I should mention that there's been quite a few moon landings, some with absolutely spectacular footage like the Firefly. But I wanted to, before we get to the interview today, I just wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive into something that's been annoying me. In fact, annoying me so much that it's kind of marring my enjoyment of space, full stop. But there's one episode in particular that I think is indicative of what's going on. And that is the exchange between Elon Musk and Danish astronaut Andreas Mogensen. And this was about the recent, and today I was watching it, the two astronauts being returned from space, and the absolute crazy story that somehow these two astronauts had been stranded. And I just wanted to use this as a sort of jumping point for what is, I think, I don't want to be political on the Interplanetary Podcast. That's not what it's about. But I do think that respectful dialogue and factual accuracy is what I want this show to be about, and I expect the rest of the space community to be about that as well. Respectful dialogue, in particular, we'll never get scientific accuracy without civility in our discussions. So, where did this all start? So, Elon Musk was on a media appearance alongside President Trump. And he said that President Biden had abandoned two American astronauts on the International Space Station for political reasons. Sunita Sunny Williams and Barry Butch Wilmore were left stranded on the ISS as a political stunt by the Biden administration. And of course, there's just no evidence that that is true. There is literally no evidence that the Biden administration deliberately left those two astronauts in space. Now, the European Space Agency astronaut Andreas Andy Mogensen, who actually has been on a SpaceX Crew Dragon mission to the ISS, called him out and basically said, this is a lie. And from someone who complains about a lack of honesty from the mainstream media. And so he was just trying to sort of say, this just isn't true. And at that point, Musk fired back with the insult, you are fully retarded and an idiot. Now, of course, that is just not the way that people should be talking to each other. Elon Musk had the opportunity to lay out why Andreas was wrong, but he decided to call him fully retarded and an idiot. And that kind of language is, quite frankly, disgusting. And, you know, this is horrible from someone with so much power to be behaving like that. And I just don't think it's right. And, of course, it focuses the whole conversation away from the facts and just straight into this feuding that we see in the mainstream media and on X that makes discussion about anything these days just brutally horrible, in my opinion. So it's horrible. Now, I thought I really does annoy me that the way that this whole coverage of Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams coming back from the ISS has been done, because like virtually every single newspaper has been rolling out this story that they were abandoned or marooned, and it's just quite simply ridiculous. So the astronauts being stranded for political reasons is misinformation. There's no truth that you can't can't call it anything else. I'd be quite happy if someone wants to come on the Interplanetary podcast and explain to me why it isn't misinformation. But there are quite simple facts that are laid out, and that is Sonny and Butch, they were testing the ISS launch vehicle, the Boeing Starliner, and that test flight had thruster failures and propulsion problems. And so NASA, not Biden, decided it wasn't safe to bring the crew back to Earth in the Starliner. And so the Boeing capsule was sent home uncrewed so that they could troubleshoot the issues. It turned out that actually it was okay. They could have had some people on board, but that's really not the point. So Starliner was out of commission, and NASA made the backup plan to integrate Butch and Sonny into the next SpaceX crew rotation flight. In other words, rather than launch a risky ad hoc rescue or rush a solution, NASA opted to extend the astronauts' stay until SpaceX Crew 9 mission could bring them home as part of the normal schedule. Now, SpaceX Crew 9 Dragon capsule had arrived at the ISS in September 2024, with only 2 instead of 4 specifically to leave 2 seats open for Wilmore and Williams' return. So that plan, formulated months in advance, was always that Butch and Sonny would come back to Earth aboard that Crew Dragon. No... on that Crew Dragon. So no special spacecraft was flown up recently or at any point to go and rescue these 2 astronauts. And NASA officials have always been very clear why the mission was extended, why those 2 astronauts had to spend more time on the space station. Nothing to do with White House politics. It was simply the safest and most logically sensible approach. And that was always the plan, and that's what Andreas was pointing out. In a press conference from Orbit, Butch Wilmore himself stated that politics played no role in the delay. So that's from the horse's mouth. They were just waiting for their ride and staying busy in the meantime. And bear in mind that these are 2 people, Sonny and Butch, these are 2 people that their entire life has been trying to be astronauts, like being astronauts. An astronaut isn't an astronaut if they're on the ground working and training. An astronaut trains to go up to the International Space Station and actually work. That is their job. So while they're doing their job, how can that be being abandoned? They are so chuffed to be there. This is what they live for. This was what they decided to do with their lives. And so this is the crazy thing. And I was trying to think of an example in the line of work that I do would be that there's a big tour. Beyonce's going on tour, and she wants to go on tour, but they've got a new piece of gear. And so they, for the drummer and the bass player, let's say, and the drummer and the bass player, they go, right, let's find two of the best session players that has ever been. And we are talking that with Butch and Sonny. They are 2 of the best astronauts that have ever lived, right? These are experienced astronauts beyond belief. And they, it'd be like, so you send these two session greats so that they're playing the drums for the first few shows. And then the flight out with their replacements, basically doesn't happen because the flight gets delayed. And then the tour moves to Southeast Asia, where they carry on doing the tour. And now it's too expensive to send a flight out. But the 2 session musicians say, hey, we're happy doing this gig. It's fine. When we get back to Europe, you can replace us with the 2 session musicians that were supposed to be on the show. But for the meantime, this is fine. And Beyonce's happy. Session musicians are happy. And it wasn't some political decision by someone like the label. It's just the way it is. It's really not that difficult to understand. So, yeah, SpaceX probably could have brought them home earlier, but there's no reason for an emergency rescue. The astronauts are safe, they're healthy, and there's always an escape for them if something goes wrong. They can get back to Earth anyway. If there's an emergency, they can do that. They're not in any danger whatsoever. Well, they are in some danger, of course, but they're not in any danger, no more danger than they are when flying back anyway. So it's just part of the normal crew rotation. So just to be ultra clear, there was no abandoned astronauts. There was no political reasons why these people were kept on there. And for Elon Musk to say it when he clearly knows that's not true, he can't possibly believe that it is true. And I've seen him repeat the same thing again today on a press conference, and I just can't understand it. And quite frankly, for someone like Elon Musk who receives public money to do this, he's being paid billions to do this, and to lie about it just seems to be beyond the pale. And I'm going to really call it out, and I think it's really important. And this is what's been upsetting me a little bit, because all of this information is out there. Tim Dodd, the everyday astronaut, he posted a detail explainer at the time. But I don't, he sort of called it a complex issue. I don't actually think it is that complex. And I think that a lot of people, and maybe even the everyday astronaut, may be guilty of this. They're a bit scared of calling out Elon Musk as a liar, as someone that isn't telling the truth, because they're worried that there's going to be consequences, that they will lose access to the SpaceX story, and it's totally grounded. But this is where society starts to fall apart, in my opinion. The moment we get scared to talk about things in a truthful and honest way is the moment it all starts to get out of hand. But not just that. I think respectful dialogue is what we should be calling back. It's fine for Musk to say these things, but he should be prepared to sit down and talk honestly about them without slurs like idiot and retard. And it could have been a potentially constructive conversation between him and another expert in space. Andreas is part of the International Space Station community. He obviously knows his stuff as well. To call an astronaut an idiot just obviously is so far from the truth. It's just, it's incivility that clouds the truth. And that's what I just wanted to get this. I know I'm not normally this serious, but I really wanted to get this off my chest. It's been bothering me for perhaps months now. And so I want to call on the whole of space community to advocate for passionate debates without personal attacks, be enthusiastic and frustrated about an issue, and voice disagreement without sacrificing respect. And I think that's so important in science and tech discussions, because we want to get to the truth. We want to create a world where we are civil to one another and it's a nice place to live. Surely that should be the goal of anyone into science or into science fiction, for example. It's that I was talking about Gene Roddenberry and his view of the future. We need that again. Maybe we need to say what is it that we want out of life, and I don't think it's like people shouting at each other on social media. So civility is the key, but also journalists, you're responsible to hold these people to account and verify the facts. You shouldn't be scared of calling these people to account. So ask tough questions and fact check rigorously. I'm not a journalist. This show's much more about space and science and communication. But to have science and communication, we must keep the debate real and we must keep it civil. So yes, that's it. I just want a call for accuracy. Prioritise scientific accuracy. Check the facts. And if someone says something bad, refute it or confirm it. And also foster civil discourse. Lead by example and model that respectful dialogue. And yeah, let's just try and move away from this social media world where I sometimes think maybe Elon Musk just says these things to rile up the other side, and that works with the algorithm. Of course, it doesn't help that he actually owns the platform that he's saying these things on. It's a major media outlet, and it's completely changed the whole story. So wherever I see this story being reported, it's just wrong, and it's so annoying to me. And I just thought I want to put the absolute ironclad point of view that there is no credible evidence or any basis of factuality to support the claim that President Biden interfered with or stopped Elon Musk from bringing back astronauts from the International Space Station for any political reasons. The decisions about astronauts' return are based on technical, safety, and logistical considerations managed by NASA in collaboration with commercial partners like SpaceX. And that is it. Their extended stay on the ISS was due to safety concerns and the need to wait for the next available and safe ride home, which was arranged through normal space mission operation procedures. That is it. There was no more to see here. Anyway, this week's guest is Alan Smale, sci-fi writer extraordinaire. So, Kutai.
The Interplanetary Podcast is alive!
So I am joined on the podcast by Alan Smale, who's just released a book called Radiant Sky. Welcome to the podcast, Alan.
Hello, thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
Oh no, it's an absolute pleasure. The listeners love sci-fi books, and we have a little bit of a club. I should imagine that some of them have read this book already. When did Radiant Sky come out?
Radiant Sky came out in November. The first book in the series, Hot Moon, came out in July of 2022. So that's been out for a while. And the sequel has just come out a couple of months ago as we're recording this.
Yeah, and they're hugely popular books, and they always seem to get like really stunning reviews from other authors and other people in the hard sci-fi world in particular. But before we get onto the concept and the vision of the book series, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to sort of have this love of space and what your journey to even writing your first book was?
Okay, yeah, sure, of course I can. My name is Alan Smale. I obviously grew up in England, although I don't live there now. I've lived in the United States since I was 28 years old, and that's quite a while now. But certainly I grew up in England with a very fond love for astronomy and for space science in general. When I was a kid, I remember going out into the back garden with my dad and using this little telescope to look up at the planets and galaxies and stuff like that. So I've always been interested in space in general. And when I went to university, my degrees were in physics and in astrophysics. But I've always also been interested in writing, and I always knew that I wanted to really try and do as much of the writing as possible. So I've had a professional career in the sciences, but in parallel, I've also been doing a lot of writing. I wrote a lot of short stories. Probably I've had about 50 short stories published in various magazines, including Asimov's Science Fiction magazine and various other magazines and original anthologies. And then I moved over to books. My first book was Ancient World and not connected to the space race in any way. That was the Clash of Eagles series that came out from Penguin Random House Del Rey. And that was in 2015. And in the Clash of Eagles series, the Roman Empire has survived in its classical form and is now moving into North America at the time when the Mississippian culture is at its height. So that was a 3-book series. It's Clash of Eagles, Eagle in Exile, and Eagle and Empire. And after that, I got going on the books that I always knew I wanted to write because I was fascinated by the Apollo program when I was a kid, like I just said. I was alive during the moon landings and do vaguely remember quite a bit of that stuff. And so I knew that one day I wanted to try and write something in that genre. So yeah, the Hot Moon books, there's really an alternate history of the space race. The first one starts in 1979. They're all set entirely on and around the moon or nearby. There are no scenes on Earth. So it's all very, very much hardcore. And it's with the books, I've also tried to stay true to the kinds of technologies that they had at that time. So this is Apollo era stuff. So it's very much Apollo capsules, command modules, lunar modules. The Soviets have continued the space race. They're up there as well. And so that's very much clunky Soyuz technology. They actually have moon landings. The Soviets have moon landings in the way that they originally intended to, but never did in our timeline. In my alternate history, in the Vivian Carter universe, the Hot Moon universe, they do manage to do that. And so we have the Cold War, but it's now in space. And occasionally, as you might imagine, the things get a bit hot from time to time. And so I did get to write fairly early on in the first book, essentially the first space battle with this extremely clunky technology and everything moving very slowly and all of that kind of stuff, which was great fun to write. So yeah, that's the Hot Moon. Those are the Hot Moon books. So 2 of them have come out already. And the third one I'm just finishing up right now. And the publication date for that will be September of this year, September 2025. And the third book in the series is called Burning Night.
What do you think it is that makes these alternate histories so popular in terms of, is it because children of the Apollo era didn't quite to get see space as it was promised?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is a lot of nostalgia about that for young and old, actually. One thing I was very impressed at was, obviously, recently we had the 50-year anniversary of the moon landing, and there was a huge amount of interest in that. And I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and we went down to the mall, and they had this special show. They had the Saturn V rocket kind of projected onto the Washington Monument. They had this whole documentary thing with the big loudspeakers that was playing on the wall. And there was a huge amount of interest, both from adults and from kids as well. So I think kids are really into rocket ships and all of that kind of stuff, and really into the things that happened then. I think it grabs their imagination, and certainly for people of my age who remember it. I mean, when I was a kid, I always assumed that when I was 9 or 10, I assumed I'd be living and working in space by the time I am the age I am now. And that clearly never happened because the US took a step back from its space adventures, and we're really starting to take the steps forward again right now. And so at that time, I think a lot of us had a lot more optimism about what was going to be happening in the future. And in the Apollo Rising books, which is actually the formal name of the trilogy, the Hot Moon books, I think people get to live that a little bit. They get to see what those times would have been like. They get to see a little taste of how things might have developed had we continued, had the technology kept improving with the moon landings, what they'd be looking like in the 1980s, for example. And I think a lot of people are just naturally very interested in that. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I do think that a lot of people would resonate with the books, whether they were alive during that time or not.
Is it more the excitement of telling stories or the excitement of saying, oh, this is what could have been? I know it's a weird question, but
I know. I think it's actually both of those things. No, I get what you're asking me. And I actually think it's very much both of those things. There's certainly fun books. There's certainly a lot of action, adventure and tension and interesting characters, because I don't think people are ever going to read a fiction book if they're not interested and invested in the characters. So I spent a lot of time on the character interactions, but it also all plays out against very much a background of how things could have gone in those days. And a lot of the designs for what's going on in the moon in my books in the 1970s and early 80s is very much based around the NASA plans for what they were expecting to do. NASA had this kind of advanced Apollo program. They were making plans for what would be happening in the future in Apollo 20 and beyond, how they would develop and stay on the moon for longer, what kinds of technologies they'd be using. And I actually adhered fairly closely to that when I was writing the books, in the same way as I steered very closely to what the Soviets had been planning to do on the moon if they'd gone. And so I try to make that as realistic as possible. Like, so all of the orbital mechanics is correct. I don't have spacecraft doing things that they wouldn't be able to do with the thrust that they had available to them. But obviously, this is not a thesis. This is not an article. It's not a journal article. So everything is realistic in that sense. And I hope that kind of sense of verisimilitude and all of that kind of stuff comes through. I hope it seems a bit believable on that score, because I tried very hard to make it as believable as possible. So I think the developments that happened during the course of the books, and the books are, but the third book finishes in the 1980s. So we're not getting to landings on Mars and things like that by the end of these books. So I have tried to stay close to what I think could have happened in our real history, use the real technologies while also telling an interesting story on top of that background.
What's your sort of research process? How far do you go in the research? Obviously, you've got that background as well, but do you still dig out NASA archives and historical documents and work your way through them?
Oh yeah, it's a huge rabbit hole, and it's very different from when I was doing my Clash of Eagles series. I was essentially writing books set in 13th century in North America, and there's very little documentation from that time from North America, obviously. So there's a certain amount of interpolation that's going on in those books. In these books, there's so much information out there, and it's all available. It's all out there on the NASA.gov website. There's a lot of historical stuff on the NASA websites, and there's a huge amount of information. When I wanted to know how spacesuits work, I can download a 100-page manual about how do you put the spacesuits on and what you connect when and how it all works and how they're made. And that's true of everything, the lunar modules and the command modules and the lunar rovers. There's a lot of lunar rover action in these books. And I was able to get into the real details, not just like Wikipedia articles or anything like that, but actual thick documents about them. And there's a lot of books about that kind of thing as well nobody can see me, but I'm looking over to the right where I have they have a bunch of shelves which are groaning with the weight of various books about the Apollo program. And Haynes manuals, actually, surprisingly, have a really good series of books that are about the NASA Apollo missions, and they're really well done. I think the human story was told a lot, but people are also interested in the technical story, and I think there's a lot of technical stuff around as well. There's a book called How Apollo Flew to the Moon, which is a big, thick book by a Brit, actually, David Woods, and that actually has all of the technical stuff. And that's about 500 pages long. So between all of the books that I read and the NASA documents about the Apollo missions, also on the web, you can find the Apollo mission journals with essentially what was coming through, what the astronauts were saying and what the ground was saying back to them, all the way through the Apollo missions, during the flights, during the time on the moon. And so all of that is documented, and it's documented very well with explanations. It's annotated with, this is what they're talking about here, and these are the buttons they're pressing. So it's really a goldmine research-wise. And the real problem I had was to wind myself back and not just spend my entire time digging into all this really fascinating stuff about what they were able to do in the 1970s. I mean, we have to remember this is the 1970s, and it's a long time ago, and we didn't have the computers that we have now, and we didn't have a lot of the material science that we have now. And what they managed to do is pretty incredible, and the more I read about it, the more impressed I am with the Apollo program and what they managed to achieve.
Yeah. It really is an understatement, isn't it? The Apollo program is just absolutely extraordinary human achievement. Well, what about the Russian side of things? How easy is it to get the information on that? Was there a sort of era where you could actually grab a lot of that information?
A lot of it has become public since the 2000s. I think a lot of information was released. At the time all of this was going on, the US knew that the Soviets were trying to get to the moon first. That's one of the reasons why Apollo 8 ended up taking a flight around the moon. That it wasn't the original mission plan for Apollo 8. They did that because they didn't want to get scooped by the Soviets putting a zonde around the moon. And so a lot of what the US was doing was driven by what the Soviets were doing. But a lot of the details didn't really come out until considerably later. In the early 2000s, I got a lot of documents from 2012 where NASA historians and people like that have dug into the Soviet archives. There have been a lot of articles in various journals about that, with the diaries of people in Russia, in the Soviet Union at the time. The Kamenin diaries came out in it's either Icarus or the Journal of whatever it's called, the Journal of Interplanetary Spaceflight, whatever that is. Anyway, so there a lot of these things did start coming out, and so there again there is a gold mine. It's not quite as detailed as the US side because the Soviet side stopped after a while, after the death of Korolev in particular. They had a lot of setbacks with launch vehicles, the N-1 launch vehicle and so forth. So they didn't have the mission experience in the same way, and a lot of it wasn't written down in manuals that are available to us in the same way. But we still know what the what the Soviet moon landing craft would look like. Their LK lander and the later LEK lander that they were planning to put up later on that would have been able to take 3 people. And so we know what those would have looked like. There are actually models of the LK lander that you can see in Russian museums to this day. They're out there, they're public. And those actually, if people are interested, there is actually a Wikipedia article on the LK lander, which has some of those pictures. If people want to just go and take a look at what the first Soviet moon landing vehicle would have looked like. But we do have a lot of in-depth information about the Soviet side as well now. And that was great to dig into that too and try and imagine how it would be from the Soviet side with Soviet technology and Soviet kind of ways of thinking, what people would be like there. And that's something that I try and do in these books as well. It's not just the valiant Americans against the big bad Soviets. I do actually have Soviet characters telling their side of the story. And of course, they're doing things for what they believe are the correct motivations. They're not that impressed with the American imperialist system as they see it. There's a lot of morally gray areas. And so that was also fun to explore, both on the technological side and to think a little bit about what it was like to be a Soviet citizen or a Soviet cosmonaut in that time.
Yeah, I want to get onto that question a little bit later, but before I get to the sort of political and the big ideology things of science fiction, is there moments where the science gets in the way of the plot, and you go, I'll bend the science a little bit just for this plot device?
There are certainly times, it's certainly quite constraining. There are times when I think, it'd be really cool if that could happen. And then I go away and I do the math and I'm like, no, they really can't do that. That's a pain in the butt. And so I'll be thinking about that for a while. So I don't allow myself to disobey the laws of physics or the laws of, the quantifiable, like how much juice you could get out of a rocket engine at any particular time. It does make the plotting interesting, actually, and I can often come up with surprises for the reader in that, in that direction as well, I think, because what sometimes will happen is that because I can't do the obvious thing, I have to find a way of doing something less obvious. And it does make me think a little bit more in some ways about that. And it does put my characters in greater jeopardy. There's a place fairly early on in Hot Moon, the first book, where I have to do quite a big plane change in an orbit around the moon for the plot to work. And essentially to do that, they have to use all the fuel they have. So that command module, the command and service module, is now going around the moon and would need to be like refueled, serviced effectively before it could do any more stuff, do any more flying around. And so that made the plot more interesting in that regard as well. So it does ends up putting the characters in greater jeopardy because of the constraints they're under. It also makes the author's life a little bit more difficult, but that's what I signed up for with these books. And so I have fun thinking about it and puzzling things over. And there's something in the third book, which I obviously won't get into because I don't want to spoil things too much, but something that was a problem for me that I actually spent weeks trying to think about how I was going to get around and rationalize and make scientifically coherent. And I did in the end, but it took me quite the while, but the effects that I'm able to come up with as a result, I think were worth the effort.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It'd be quite cool, wouldn't it, if there was a sort of hard science fiction writer in the mission control during Apollo 13, because of course they're trying to think of the scenarios to make the story kind of feasible, I guess. How are we going to get them back from the moon when this has gone wrong? I mean, it's yeah, I really like that. I love that aspect of it. And are there authors sort of leading up to that you were kind of admired for the way that they also sort of kept to that? I guess it's a very cool rule, isn't it, that you can't bend the physics to suit the story, and actually it probably gives you some story that you might not have had otherwise. Were there other authors that sort of pioneered that technique, as it were?
There is a book by Stephen Baxter, another Brit, called Voyage, which is that's an alternate history set partly in the past and partly in what was then his future, about putting a mission on Mars, about the first mission to Mars. And I think that book tried to adhere fairly closely to what was technologically feasible. I think a lot of science fiction writers actually try and do the best they can with things like that. There are often cases where people are writing far future stuff where they have to assume faster than light travel or whatever. But I think there are also quite a few authors who are trying to do things kind of strictly by the book. And I think certainly when you're doing an alternate history of this kind of timeline, then you have to stay fairly true to it, or people are just not going to really be interested in something that's essentially a Star Wars fantasy-like thing that involves the Apollo program. Baxter's the only one I can really think of. I'm sure there are others that if I thought a little bit harder, I would be able to figure out.
Yeah, because I guess Arthur C. Clarke, he's too far in the future, isn't it? It's too speculative, and even though, I mean, I've read a few Baxter ones as well. They're really very, very cool books. I notice in sort of science fiction that comes from, say, the 60s and the 70s, they're often kind of a veiled attempt at like showing sort of dystopian futures, aren't they? And it doesn't seem like the sort of modern authors like yourself, that's not the kind of motivation behind the work. Is that fair? Is that fair enough to say?
I think so, yes. I think it was fair enough for people who were writing then to have a lot of gloom and doom, because they were in the Cold War, and a lot of people who are much younger don't have that experience of being under the threat of nuclear annihilation, which was very real to people who were growing up in the 60s, 70s, even the 1980s. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of, I think, justifiable fear that the world could end up like in a horrible nuclear conflagration. And so I think a lot of the solemnity, I think a lot of the seriousness of the science fiction that was written in that time comes from that kind of mindset where these things could happen. And a lot of the people, a lot of the characters in the Hot Moon books are obviously living in those times as well, when they realize that things are very precarious and that there could be missteps between the Soviet Union and the US that could involve in the planet being destroyed. A lot of these we know quite a lot about these days, like the Cuban Missile Crisis and a lot of things that happened in the 1980s, which actually have counterparts in these books, with like the Korean airline disaster and the Able Archer exercise that the Russians actually thought might be a prelude to nuclear war to the US leading up to a preemptive strike. A lot of that was really kind of real at the time to people. And so that's where that comes from. I think what I'm trying to do is, while respecting that kind of mindset and portraying people with that mindset, I do also want to show like the interest and fun of this. I think you can tell from the title of the trilogy, the Apollo Rising trilogy, I'm obviously kind of optimistic. There are bad things that happen in the books, but overall, I think they do present an optimistic view of the space program as it could have been. And I think it's an ultimately hopeful view of humanity's future in space, the way I've tried to deliver it.
Yeah, so in terms of the way that you portray society and where it's heading, do you stick to, like you said, you're sort of looking back at an era as an alternate history. Do you try and sort of have, I guess, express the societal kind of things going on, the current attitudes and etc. from that era, or do you try and extrapolate a new set of societal norms from the very fact that the space race kept going and would kind of change society? Where do you lie on that?
Some things are going to be the same and some things are going to be different. And so what happens in these books is the broad structure of what happens, like on a very broad very broad canvas. What happens is somewhat the same, in that you have the Soviets and the Americans competing in a very strong sense, and that competition costing them a great deal of money. One of the things about these books, it was trying to make the economic side of it make sense as well. How do the Americans afford this? How do the Russians, how do the Soviets manage to afford this? And in fact, the reason behind that is that the US spends much less money in the Vietnam Wars, but it's still a problem. And all the way through the 1980s, the Soviets were having, in our timeline, I'm now talking about the real world, and all through the 1980s, the Soviets were having greater and greater difficulty keeping up with the US. They had a lot of oil money, which they burned through in the beginning of the decade. And then their economy started getting more and more frayed because they were trying to keep up with the US in the arms race. They actually ended up debilitating their own economy. And so there weren't as many consumer goods on the shelves for Soviets, for people all across the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They were really kind of bankrupting themselves because they had to try and keep pace with the Americans. That kind of societal thing is the same in the Hot Moon books, because that's an economic driver, right? A lot of the things that happen on Earth militarily, with the invasion of Afghanistan that features in book one, kind of in the backdrop. A lot of those things are going to keep happening just as they would, but the timing may be a little bit different. So I think in broad geopolitical terms, things are similar. I think because of what happens, because the space race does continue, and of other things going on, things don't necessarily happen at the same time. I have a different succession of presidents in the United States, for example. It's all named figures who people will recognize, but they come in a slightly different order just because certain things have changed in the timeline. So it's still a recognizable timeline in that there are people who you will know. The Soviet side is also a recognizable timeline, although some of their politicians have, because of what's happening, I think it actually affects them in a sense more than it affects the US, because the whole structure has changed there. They're now a spacefaring nation. And so the political system is still the same, but there are slightly different people in power at different times. Andropov comes to power earlier for various reasons that make sense in the book. And so things like that. So I am writing very much in that world. In book two, in the second book, you can see in the backdrop the US public is getting less interested in the Apollo missions and more interested in environmental things, just as they did in our universe, because I think those things would have been the same. So I tried to keep things the same where I thought they would probably have stayed the same in my estimation. And but there are other things. It's obviously not going to be a simple repeat of what's happening, because there are other things going on. There are different processes would have led to different results in some areas. So yeah, so it's really a mixture of the two. I've tried to make it a believable 1980s, and a lot of the structure is the same. And on top of that, though, some things are actually quite different.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, one of my favourite things when I'm reading, any work, especially science fiction, though, is the actual sort of central characters, and the central characters having a journey, a character arc, I suppose, classically. How on earth do you start writing, presumably you have a central character or central characters. I think you mentioned one of them right at the beginning. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so how do you start with a character that presumably isn't fully fledged at that point, that they've got quite a journey to go on, but you want them to be compelling enough? And this is potentially the start of like you writing for the next 10 years of trilogies, et cetera, et cetera. How do you go about developing those initial characters, or are they pretty much there when, is it quick or is it a slow process to get there?
The main character in the books is Vivian Carter, and she's the commander of Apollo 32. So she's the first woman commander of an Apollo, not the first American woman in space, because there have been several others. She's not going to be the first woman on the moon, because there are already two women there on another mission. Women do get into the Apollo program a little earlier as a result of this particular history. That's one change that happens, because one of the first people on the moon from the Soviet side is female, and so the US correctly put some more women into the astronaut program, and so they arrive there a little earlier. So we're in 1979 when the book starts, and Vivian Carter is the commander of Apollo 32. And so the idea is that she's going to the moon in charge of an expeditionary Apollo to land at the Marius Hills and spend 10 days there on what looks like a typical Apollo mission, kind of like Apollo 17 if it was stretched out to being a 10-day mission, very similar kinds of technologies, but obviously enhanced so that they can stay there for longer. So that's the beginning setup. As the books progress, the technologies get more get improved gradually with time, just as they did in our timeline. The technologies that Apollo 17 crew took to the moon were quite different from what the Apollo 11 people had. There is the march of progress there. In terms of the characterizations, it's a reasonably large cast of characters. There are some characters who are in all three books and others who come and go. I did have a pretty good idea, even though I wrote the first book as a standalone, thinking in the back of my mind, there could be more if people want this. And here's what I would do if there were more books. Here's where Vivian would go next. Here's the next leap forward. Here are the next steps. So I did kind of think of it like that. I did want to nail the characters down pretty hard and fast. When I'm writing, what I normally start with is the setting. And like in the Clash of Eagles books, I knew I wanted to write about Cahokia, which is this Native American city where St. Louis is now a mound city. So I knew I wanted to have I wanted to portray this ancient American civilization. And then the characters came later. And it's kind of similar with these books in that I knew the kind of thing that I wanted to write. And then I wanted to know, whose story is this? Whose story, like, who is this conflict important to? How is she going to change during the course of this? And the idea behind that is that at the beginning, Vivian Carter is immensely gung-ho about the moon, as I think anybody would have to be. A lot of the astronauts of those days were extremely driven people, driven men in our timeline, but driven people. And they are very much a certain type of person, sort of test pilot, perhaps not super imaginative, but very competent. And so she is a very competent person, and she is dealing very well with some situations that she's in. And then everything just totally changes around her due to the Cold War activity, and her mission gets literally shot to hell. And it's a question of what happens after that on the lunar surface. And a lot of that kind of tension and conflict, sort of in a way, it's kind of drove itself once I had the situation and the characters, and I knew who the Soviet characters were and what their motivations were and the kind of technologies they had. So in a sense, it was, and she does change during the courses of the books as well. I should say that as well. Her motivation changes quite dramatically during the course of the books. And so she's heading towards Earth. I guess it's a slight spoiler that I've given away that she survives. But anyway, she's very much a changed person by the end of the books. And what she wants by the end of the books is completely different to how she started out. Is that kind of where you were going with that question?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it was more like, how do you even set about, because you're writing about this person for such a long length of time, it's got to be right, hasn't it? Right from the beginning, you've got to kind of almost have this. It's almost, like a recipe. You're going to stick it in the oven for hours on end. Unless you've got that initial ingredients right, it's going to turn out garbage, right? So it's more, what's your process to make sure that your character is this robust character, fit for that journey, fit for fit for a book to hang itself on.
Yeah, some of that I actually figure out in dialogue, strange to say. I knew she was going to be a female commander. She's got her crew, Ellis Meyer and Dave Horn, who are both guys, her lunar module pilot and her command module pilot. And I actually kind of worked out her personality by having these characters chat to each other, like what would be their command structure. A lot of the Apollo astronauts, you can actually read the transcripts, like I said, and you can see they actually had a fairly relaxed command structure. The commander was the one who flew down to the moon and all of that kind of stuff. And they were sort of the boss of the mission, but they were all like had a fine camaraderie and joked around with each other. And it wasn't as military a structure. It is more of a kind of, sometimes with some of the astronauts in the real world, it was almost playful. The crew of Apollo 12 were all constantly kind of joking with each other and messing around. And so I was kind of defining her to start with and defining the other characters by how they interacted with each other and where they were competent and where they are obviously slightly less competent, and just kind of putting together the characters that way in a sort of interactive way. And I have what is effectively a Skylab from our world, but it's in orbit around the moon, and there are six male astronauts aboard the Skylab. And we get to see these characters fairly early on. And so I've got 6 guys, right? They're all male, they're all astronauts, they're all Americans, but I want them all to have, I don't want them all to be the same guy. I don't want them all to be 6 copies of the same human being here. All of the real world astronauts in our timeline were very, very different characters, and I wanted these to be very, very different characters as well. And so I figured that out in kind of in a similar way. And it's not so much like what they look like. Occasionally, it's what their accents are and which part of the country they come from. Who is southern and maybe speaks in a slightly slower accent? Who has a Bostonian clipped accent or whatever? But it's also in terms of like their personality and how they move, I suppose, and like how they interact with the people around them and how to give them all distinctive voices. And so I do spend a lot of time on that. And I go through after I think I finish the book, I actually do go through and I do a character consistency check to make sure that my characters all actually do, even the kind of small spear carrier roles, they do actually come off as being real people with real motivations and different levels of experience, because some people in the Apollo program are going to be rookies and they're not going to be as confident as the guys who've been around for 4 space flights or been up in space for 2 months or something. They're just not going to move the same way. They're not going to have the same experience levels. Occasionally they're going to need to be told what to do or given a little bit more information about how to achieve a certain task. And just all of that kind of back and forth between the characters, I think, is a good way of getting the individual, like, scene-to-scene characterization worked out well. And then I think something you're alluding to is the broad character arcs of the main characters and how to make sure that they have a recognizable journey through this with their own individual setbacks and what they do when they're confronted with those setbacks and how they move on from that and what works and what doesn't work. So it is kind of a complicated process. And I did spend a lot of time, I spent as much or more time on the characterization as I did on researching the background of, you know, how you get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in a spacesuit or in a command module and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's often something that's kind of, you know, is always one of those sticks that's beat sci-fi with, isn't it? That the characters aren't good enough, and a lot of the time I completely disagree with it. But it almost seems like that you get to know the characters that you're writing, that they're talking, and do you in that process of getting to know the characters, do you kind of like them more or less, or do you not mind so much about whether you like these characters or not? It's more the fact that they become interesting rather than likable?
Yeah, I certainly come from the aspect of them being interesting. One of the back and forths I had with my editor when we were editing Hot Moon was like exactly how assertive. My editor is female, and it's good to get the female perspective, obviously. And we did have a little bit of discussion about, is Vivian too assertive in this situation or not assertive enough? So there was a little bit of back and forth on that about trying to figure out, you know, exactly how important it was that she be likable and how important it was that she be competent. And I think we found a great kind of territory there where she comes off as being, I think actually in the final version, she's slightly more sympathetic character than I had originally made her. I made her a bit more of a hard ass because of the people that she'd be dealing with. And I think a little bit of that got toned down. And I think that was the correct answer. But by and large, I think that, yes, some characters likable and some characters are not so likable. I think there is one of my it's actually another female character, a cosmonaut, Svetlana Belyakova, who I think in many ways is not that likable, but she is very intriguing. And I think the fact that she's intriguing and interesting is obviously a major part of why I enjoyed writing her. And a lot of readers seem to be responding to that as well. And kind of being interested in her character and what's going to happen to her over the course of the books. And then some astronauts are jerks. And so in these books as well, there are some people who are actually not that likable. And again, they have their own particular competencies, but you can tell they're not people you'd actually want to be around for very long. But they're part of the environment. If you have 18 people in a particular situation, not everybody's going to be super likable. I don't like the science fiction trope that you often see on TV, where people are having arguments all the time and having like even fist fights all the time. You do see that in TV science fiction. It's an easy way of doing conflict. There was a science fiction show on PBS in America recently called Mars, which was kind of a drama about people going to Mars. And a lot of the characters spent a lot of time fighting each other. And I'm just thinking, coming from like that kind of background, I do have a NASA background, but not in the human spaceflight program. And I'm thinking NASA isn't going to choose these people. They're not going to be, there's certainly going to be some tension and a little bit of subdued pushback and aggression and all of that, but they're still going to be trying to get the mission done. They're still going to be trying to get the job done. There's going to be a little bit of passive aggressive stuff, but everyone's working together for the same thing. It's not going to just erupt into fistfights or that kind of massive drama. And this is a very long answer to what I think you were originally asking.
No, it's really interesting, because I couldn't agree more with that. I couldn't agree.
So anyway, yes, you do see that there are some unlikable characters, but I think the conflicts are a little more subtle. I think it's not, and a little more realistic to the kind of person that becomes an astronaut and the kind of people that the NASA mission managers would be putting on crucial missions like this.
It's super interesting, because it really winds me up. Even with sort of the Star Trek-y stuff, it's like you see the modern Star Trek movies, and everything descends into a fist fight. And even the old ones, they're sorting it out like adults. It almost seems like modern science fiction has them all down as children, which just kind of seems very peculiar in a way, because it's like, it's very unlikely that the captain of a starship or even a lunar lander is going to be the type of person that breaks out into a fist fight. So I couldn't agree more with that. That's really interesting to get the other perspectives, and I guess that is why having an editor is a fantastic thing, right? As a writer, that it's that another place to check for consistency. When you'd finished this first book, were you thinking about, once it was finished, were you thinking about its sequel, or were you waiting to see how successful you were first?
This book was just sold as a single standalone to start with. And this can go two ways in publishing. The Clash of Eagles series I sold as a trilogy to Del Rey, and it was always going to be a trilogy. So I had the whole story arc mapped out in much more detail than I did for the Apollo Rising books, for the Vivian Carter books. I knew I was interested in the story. I didn't have the second book mapped out in anywhere near the amount of detail that I had the second Clash of Eagles book mapped out when I finished the first one. And to a certain extent, there was a wait and see element to this. But the early reviews came back very well. Anybody looking up Hot Moon online will see that there's a Larry Niven blurb on the front cover. Larry Niven read it and loved it, and that was obviously like amazing to me, because I grew up reading Larry Niven. And he was one of the great science fiction writers from like the Golden Age and slightly beyond that I grew up reading and admiring. So I was immensely thrilled by that. Robert J. Sawyer blurbed me, and Rick Wilbur, and various other people, and so that was immensely exciting. I was super thrilled with all of that, and the reviews came in well, and the publisher said, we're going to need more of these, right? And he started referring to it as a series when he was talking to people about it, even before we'd actually agreed that it was a series. So obviously, my publisher Shahid Mahmood, obviously he'd figured this out by that time, and so. Then I was like, okay, well, I can certainly do that. I had an idea in my mind about how the technologies were going to have improved by 1983. There is a gap between the first and second books of a few years. And so the capabilities on the moon are a lot greater by the time Vivian goes into her second adventure. And they spent a while figuring out how that would work and what would be realistic and what wouldn't, and how everything would fit together. But actually, when I was writing the second book, it almost felt uncanny. It almost felt like I'd been leaving hooks for myself in the first book that I hadn't been realizing I was doing at the time. It was almost like this subconscious thing of thinking, oh, that really works there. And, oh, I need this character again. And it just so happens there they are. And so actually, Radiant Sky, the second book, that was that actually came together quite quickly. I spent a while planning it out before I signed the contract for the second book because I wanted to be absolutely sure in my own mind that I could make it just as good or better than the first book. So I didn't actually. It perhaps sounds contradictory, but I didn't actually agree immediately to writing the second book until I really understood the second book. But after that, I was incredibly gung ho about it. And when I put in the detailed outline for the second book, I said, "Oh no, by the way, here's what happens in the third book. A few paragraphs about that." And that's essentially what's happening in the book that I'm writing now.
Excellent. And is it going to end at a trilogy, or do you think you might go further?
I think certainly as far as Vivian Carter is concerned, the third book ends her story. I could possibly see it going further. There's certainly a world where more could happen. It might be interesting to see where we are by the end of the 1980s or whatever. That would need to be with different characters. If there's enough interest in the books, I might consider it. I don't actually have a clear idea or process or anything in my head. I have a few random thoughts, but I don't have anything detailed, like knowing exactly what would happen or anything. I think I would want a break as well. I think I've lived in the 1970s and 80s for a while now, and in this kind of technology arena, and thinking a lot about the moon and the conditions on the moon and the conditions in space. So I think I might want to do something else in the meantime. I would be open to writing more in the Vivian Carter universe, in the Apollo Rising series, if there was of interest, but it would necessarily be with at least some different characters.
Yeah, I mean, in writing these books and obviously doing all this research and seeing how things play out politically, do you think that gives you a pretty good insight into what's going to happen in essentially the Artemis Rising, let's call it, in the next, say, 10 years? Do you feel as though you've got a good handle of about how you see that playing out, and maybe we replace Russia with China, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a very interesting landscape that we're in right now with Artemis and all of that. And I'm thrilled that we're going back to the moon, and I'm obviously sad it's taken this long. But I think we're going with a well-structured program. I think NASA's program is good. It's obviously cautious. It's more cautious than what was going on in the Apollo program, where they were changing the plan left and right, like with every mission, essentially, going forward. They kept changing the landing sites, changing the crews, changing everything. And so NASA was a much more dynamic place in those days. And I think what's happening now is much more methodical and calm. But I think it's essentially a good system, the SLS launch system and the Orion spacecraft and all of that. And so I think the plan is basically good. And then there's all of these commercial players as well. There's all of this interest in the moon from SpaceX and Blue Origin. There are these various industries and various commercial lunar payload services that are getting in on the act now. So it's a very difficult landscape. And because of that, even I'm only talking about America now, even on the American side, the landscape is kind of very exciting, but also very uncertain about what's going to happen when, and what the steps are going to be. And then when you throw in the interest from other countries, you mentioned China already. They've been already very successful with their Chang'e series of lunar landers. That's been some great stuff. And we have other countries like India, and ESA is interested, and Israel is interested in the moon. So there's a lot of countries that are showing a great interest in the moon now. And so I think now there's a momentum that we didn't have in the 1970s, the late 60s and the early 70s in our current timeline. I think now that whatever happens, even if the US were to fold, if Artemis were to sadly get cancelled the day after tomorrow for some reason, I think humanity would still be going ahead. We'd still be going back to the moon. Various people in other countries would still have that impetus. We will have human footprints again on the moon, I'm sure, in the next few years. And I hope they're American footprints, because I'm a US citizen now, and I kind of like the idea of the US keeping up the charge here. But in a way, I'd be just as pleased if they were Chinese footprints, because that would mean that everybody's engaged, right? That everybody would be I think the competition is a little different than it was then, but I think there is still is a competitive element, and I am happy to see that, and I'm certainly going to be very interested. I hope a lot happens on the moon in my remaining lifetime, so that I can watch it from afar and enjoy it.
Yeah. I missed out on the moon landing, so I've got to I've got to wait my turn. So I think I was around for the final one, but I was a baby, so I missed it. So that's really interesting. So could you see yourself writing, instead of in the alternate history hard sci-fi, could you see yourself writing in a more speculative sci-fi that's sort of future based, or where you'd have to do a bit more world building, I guess?
Yeah, a lot of what I've written in the last 10 or 15 years has been alternate history. And people have sometimes found it odd, I mean, for me, because I do have this hard science background, right? I've been a research scientist for all of my career. I retired in August of 2023. But before that, I had a long career doing science research, astrophysics research. And so people think it's funny, or sometimes think it's a little odd that I've taken so much alternate history. And one of the reasons why is because it was very different from the day job. It was something that was a complete change of pace for me from the science world that I was living in. So, and obviously with the Apollo books, the Hot Moon series, the two passions have converged. And so now I'm writing very much about NASA and about Apollo and about space science, even in an alternate history setting. And my agent keeps saying, I want to know what your hard science fiction book would look like. And by that, she means a futuristic book. And I have thought about that. I have spent some time mapping out, in particular, to start with, those short stories that I would want to write, because I want to start getting back to the short lengths as well, having written novels for so long. So I have been sort of thought to futuristic stories, to sort of stories that are set maybe in the near future in the solar system, so some distance out from where we are now, but very much in the future and not in the past. And so I've given that some thought, and I've given the world building some thought. I'd want it to be as rigorous as possible. I have written fantasy stories, but I don't think I would ever go back to being a fantasy writer in the future. I think my brain is more hardwired towards the rigorous side of things, whether it's historical or scientific. So yeah, I think that is possible, and I think I would enjoy that kind of world building and being set free from history, if you like, because when you're writing alternate history, you have to stay true to at least some parts of history. And I would be freed of that constraint if I was working in the future, if I was writing in the future. And so that might be an interesting thing to do. And I'm certainly thinking of doing that. I have no firm plans for what that would be yet, but I'm certainly not ruling out something in the next few years that would be a more future speculative side.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Yeah. So yeah, people listening, look out for it. So the other thing, I know that people listening, when they hear science fiction authors talking, is that they want to write their own science fiction. So what have you got any kind of advice for aspiring science fiction writers, or just writers in general? How do you start? Because it does seem like an awfully laborious process.
It is actually a laborious process. It takes a long time to write books, and it takes a long time to write long books, which is where I seem to have found myself, books with lots of plot and character and background and all. But I did start in the short fiction realm, and I think that is still a good place to start. If there are some people who are naturally just not short fiction writers, who are naturally novel writers, and there's nothing wrong with that either. But the way I learned, the way that worked best for me coming up, was writing different things. I've written horror, I've written fantasy, I've written science fiction, and I ended up in alternate history. But I tried out a lot of other things first, and I tried out a lot of ways of telling a story and experimented. And I think the short fiction area is a good area to allow you to experiment, because you're only writing the book for a week, the story for a week or a month or whatever, and so that's a limited playground, and you're not trapped for a year in writing something that's not going to sell or whatever. So I think endurance actually is a lot of it. I've been to a lot of writers' workshops. I was in the Writers of the Future contest. I was a winner back in 1995. This is a short fiction contest. Back in 1995. And I was in a workshop that they did after this with a bunch of other writers who were really very good. We were all about the same level. We were all, we'd all won this contest, and we all had stuff to learn, but we were all at a pretty good level. And a lot of those guys and the people have dropped out now, and I don't see their names around. And I think what I had that they didn't have really was endurance. And I really have wanted to do this my whole life. I've wanted to be a full-time writer all my life, and now I am. And that was something that was always very important to me. And so I think that stick-to-itiveness, I think that willingness to just put in the hours and write even when you don't feel like writing is important. I think it's important to focus a lot on character as well as ideas. You did touch on this. There is a lot of science fiction. There was a lot of science fiction published in which the characters weren't very good, particularly in the past. I don't think it's as true now. And there are some works in the past for which it was not true. But sometimes character has had short shift in writing science fiction. And I think it's important to keep the focus on the characters. And I'd say actually even more important nowadays. I think there's a lot more character-driven. I think being character-driven is a lot more important in selling stories in today's market than it used to be. And I do see some short fiction, in fact, where the world building isn't particularly good, but the characterization and the interactions are superb. And I think the current fiction market is actually a little more forgiving of inconsistent world building than it used to be in the past, where the world building was everything. The other thing I would say is, particularly if you're writing a book, is you really need to love what you're writing about, because otherwise you'll get bored with it. And with the Hot Moon books, it must be clear by now, always been fascinated by space and the Apollo program. So if I have to read more about it, I'm actually rereading some of the manuals that I read when I was writing the first book, because that was a long time ago. And enjoying getting back into the nitty gritty of some of the things that I was reading like 7 or 8 years ago when I was writing the first book. And the same with the Clash of Eagles series. I spent a lot of time reading about Romans, a lot of time reading about North American cultures and geology and biology and all kinds of stuff about plants and things that are in the backdrop of the Clash of Eagles series. So you have to really love what you're writing, because you're going to spend a lot of time researching if you're writing anything similar to what I'm writing. And you're going to also spend a lot of time rewriting and editing and looking at the same words again and again. So I think it does require that kind of interest and bloody-minded, real endurance, because it is a tough business to get into. And I think it's as tough now or tougher than it's ever been.
Yeah, if someone came up to you and said, "Well, we want to adapt this into TV or film," is that the sort of thing where going back and writing the screenplay would be either a sort of tedious thought or a thought that would fill you with joy?
If an offer like that came through, I would actually have to stop and think about it for a moment. I think I would like the idea. I would think that actually screenwriting and novel writing are two actually quite different skills, even though they may seem similar. It's all about like plot and arc and timing and pacing, very much about pacing and storytelling and all of that. But there are some things that are kind of unique to screenwriting, and one of those things is being able to tell a story in a small number of pages. And I'm probably going into the weeds more than you were hoping with this answer, but screenplays are often like 120 pages or something like that, and fairly sparse texts, whereas novels can be 400 pages. So you have to decide what to put in and what to leave out, and how to really focus the story. I think I would probably want to do that. I think I would like to, but I would not be at all averse to collaborating with somebody else, with somebody who's already a screenwriter, and getting some input from them along the way. I actually think beta readers are important to ordinary fiction writing, but I think particularly if I was doing a Netflix limited series or a movie or something like that, that it would be important to get other eyes into it to do that. I would love the opportunity, actually. I'd love to be involved in that. And I know other writers are different about this, and there are some people who just say, go, take my work and do with it what you will. It will be different. I understand that it will be different. I'll just sit here and cash the checks. I would like to be involved. I know a lot of writers are executive producers on their own work, and I think that would be great too. So, yeah, I would love to be involved, and the level of my involvement might depend on the project and who the other people involved were.
Yeah.
From your mouth to your deal, I would love to. I would love it if there was some interest in dramatizing any or all of the works that I've done.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to leave because I've had you for over an hour now, and I don't want to keep you for much longer. I'm going to give you one final question, if you're okay answering it. Is if Vivian Carter was it did go to a film or a TV series, is there a particular actress that in your mind would do a good job?
No, you'd be surprised how often I get that question and how bad I am at answering it. There was a whole Twitter thread back when Twitter was good. There was a whole Twitter thread about the Clash of Eagles books that people were writing and saying, "Oh, I think this character would be good for Gaius Marcellinus. I think this character would be good for Sintakala." And I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. I actually don't have stars or people in mind for any of these people. It's actually an interesting question. Because of some of the situations Vivian finds herself in, it would probably have to be somebody with a fairly compact physique and somebody who is pretty, capable of doing action stuff. But there are a lot of actresses in Hollywood now who could do that. She's pictured on the cover as being kind of sort of having dark blonde hair, but hair can be changed. So no, actually, in answer to your question, I don't actually know who would portray Vivian Carter or any of the other people in any of my books, and so I don't really have any preconceived notions there about casting.
No, it's almost like when I'm reading a book, obviously the characters slowly become visually like 3D in my head. I have that kind of, mind that gives them a face and gives them a body, etc. They become embodied. And I wonder if that's the same with you when you're writing them, whether that they do actually have a kind of face and body, and therefore it might be weird to have an actress or playing that role, because it'd be like nobody actually fits it because you've already got such a strong idea of what this person looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's certainly a very big part of that, of me having this mental impression of what they look like. And it is a composite. It's not one person. On the front of the Clash of Eagles books, the characters are actually portrayed. So on the front of Clash of Eagles, it's a close-up of Gaius Marcellinus, my Roman. And on the Eagle in Exile, it's a young Native American character, a male character. And on the third book, it's Sintakala, the name I just mentioned, who is a very strong female Native American character in the books. And there they were visualized. And I have to say that I didn't have anything to do with how these, with what faces were chosen for that. But as soon as I saw them, I thought those are really good choices for those faces and for those characters. And now that's what they look like in my mind. But certainly when I was writing the books, they didn't necessarily look like that. So it's interesting because I know there are other people who have very strong opinions. There are people who always saw Gaius Marcellinus as looking like Russell Crowe because Russell Crowe is in Gladiator and he's a powerful guy, Roman dude, And so that was, even though the stories are completely dissimilar, they kind of pictured Russell Crowe in that situation, and I didn't necessarily at all. But it's kind of interesting to play with that kind of thing, and it's interesting to see what other people come up with when they're doing this kind of role.
Well, thanks very much for telling us a little bit about the process and how you get there and the mind of the science fiction writer. We'll probably, we're bound to have some discussion. I'm sure, like I said, quite a few of the listeners, because we have a Patreon channel where you can join our Discord with all and we have a kind of little book club in there, and we talk about lots of various different books and which ones we like, etc. So it'll be interesting to see, who of the listeners, the patrons, have actually have read the book, and we can have a nice discussion around it. But it's really interesting to hear the kind of how these things come together and yeah, I wasn't expecting you. What's good is that on the call I wasn't expecting you to have an English accent. I was expecting to speak to someone American.
Well, yeah, that's
good. So that's excellent. Well, thanks very much for coming on. Is there anything you would like to add?
We did cover the ground fairly well on Hot Moon. I mean, if people want to check me out online, you can find me at www.alansmale.com, SMALE. And you can find the books, obviously, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, various other places. I'm pretty sure they're also covered by Waterstones and other British places.
Are there audio versions of the books?
Yes, there are audiobook versions, and I got to say they're really excellent. They're narrated by Vivian Lehaney, who is a great voice actress. And she is actually terrific. She's quite well known in the audiobook industry, and she's done some acting in movies as well. And she's very good. I was speaking earlier about differentiating between the characters, particularly when you have a whole bunch of dudes at a space station or whatever. And she is very good at differentiating the voices for different characters. She also does a terrific Russian accent for the Soviet characters. So the audiobooks are available, and they're very well worth checking out. So yes, I would definitely recommend those. And the Clash books are in audiobook form as well.
Fantastic. That's good for me, because that's how I like to do my commute with a good bit of sci-fi.
Yeah.
Good bit of hard sci-fi. Yeah, well, fantastic. Well, thanks very much.
Thanks very much for having me on. This has been a great discussion, and I've really enjoyed talking about the books and the process and all that.
You're listening to the Interplanetary Podcast, putting the ace back into space.
There we go. That's all we got time for. Thanks very much for joining me for the last 1 hour, 20 minutes. Just leaves me time to thank all those brilliant Patreons out there who still make this possible. Thank you so much, everyone. They are Ben Guthrie, Kate Seal, Mark Huber, Jean Watch-Tannick, Mark Schoen, Adam French, Steve Croucher, Stuart Lawson, Tyrrell McAllister, Marissa Davis, Jim King, Dr. Bob Hodges, Mark Kelly. Thank you so much, everyone, for your support and continued support. It's absolutely amazing. Still can't quite believe it. You are legends. If you want to be a Patreon, it is now free. You can join us for free. Come and join our Discord as well and talk about the book. That would be awesome. It is patreon.com/interplanetary. If you're interested, that would be awesome. We'll be back soon. Thank you so much for tuning in. But for now, bye-bye, Spotcast!